Hello, I am Rebecca Gomez Farrell. I am SFWA's Communications Manager, and this video is to help all of you learn about the Givers Fund Grant, which has an application deadline coming up soon on October 1st. We are speaking today with Nathan Lowell, who is the Chief Financial Officer for the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America, and Oz Drummond, who is the Comptroller for the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America. Oz and Nathan both have a lot to do with the organization of the Givers Fund Grant program. So let's begin. My first question for you both is, what is the purpose of the Givers Fund Grant?
The Givers Fund is for SFWA to help organizations and individuals who are doing outward-facing support for writers of science fiction and fantasy. Go ahead, Oz.
Go ahead, Oz. Well, basically, I think you've pretty much got it, Nathan, that the idea of the Givers Fund was to find ways to promote science fiction and fantasy writing events, things like that, outside of SFWA.
SFWA is a small organization. We can't do everything, but what we can do is help support other people who can do things by helping them fund those operations.
Okay, so my understanding is the Givers Fund grants must be used to further SFWA's mission.
Absolutely.
Remember, when I say science fiction and fantasy, I mean science fiction, fantasy, horror, related genres, add-ons. We're not talking just short stories. We're talking short stories, novels, magazines, games, videos. I mean, there's this whole panoply of things that are in play. So anything that somebody wants to do that will help support or promote science fiction and fantasy, that's good. That's within our purview.
That's right. So who is the ideal applicant for a Givers Fund?
The ideal applicant is another 501c3, which is a public charity, or it's some sort of university, some sort of municipal group. It could even be a church organization. Anything can be a foreign entity as well. Whatever it is, it needs to be, that's the ideal, is that it is itself some form of not-for-profit.
Okay. Do applicants have to be a not-for-profit organization to apply, or is there some leeway in there?
No, they don't, but the bar to get a grant is set a lot higher because there can't be a benefit to the owners or the individuals in it.
Okay, so you wouldn't say that they shouldn't apply, but they should understand that it's a higher bar that they need to.
They absolutely should apply. If someone has a pet project and they volunteer their time and they're devoted to that pet project. We had someone start a reading series on his own with his own money. And that's exactly the kind of project that SFWA would support by an individual or a for-profit. He actually had a company. So, but in that case, what we were doing was we were supporting the actual expenses of his reading series.
Can an individual writer apply to support their own work?
No. Short answer, no. We aren't going to fund you to write your novel. We're not going to pay your travel expenses to go to a cabin in Alaska so that you can get away. We're not going to put you on a cruise ship. We're not going to pay for your groceries while you're writing. That's what everybody has to do. And it's not outward facing. It's not something that's being done for the giver. We aren't the giver. The giver is the person who is applying. If you're not giving something
to the science fiction and fantasy genre.
Yeah.
Yes, you're giving. The idea is that the applicant is trying to give back to the science fiction and fantasy community and raise it up in some way, make it better and bigger.
So you mean even if they consider themselves a gift to the community, that is not a qualification?
Well,
Yeah,
okay,
pretty much.
I'm the CPA and I'm the tax expert, and basically the way I would say it is, if this would be taxable income to you, then we don't award a grant for it. And in that case, if we were to pay you to write, that would be taxable income. We would have to issue you a 1099 for the grant.
I think that's very clear. Is the grant only open for SFWA members?
Absolutely not.
No,
Absolutely not.
because
It's open to anyone.
remember that the people who apply for grants aren't really people, they're organizations. They're applying for their operation, even if it's a one-person operation.
But some of our best our most exciting and hugely impacting applicants, that's what we mean by best, they come from members who have pet charities that they love, workshops that they've been to that they think are fantastic, not-for-profit workshops. And they say, I want them to apply for one of these grants. And so that's how SFWA members get involved, is SFWA members always know about their local library is trying to do something, or they want to help their library. Please, have readers come in, have speakers come in, get the kids reading science fiction, fantasy, and horror stories. That's how members can get involved.
They can be advocates, which is
Yes.
excellent. What sort of expenses can Givers Fund grants be used for?
My rule of thumb is we pay for things, not people. So if you have to get an extra license for Zoom to have your online conference, sure, that's legit. If you have to advertising expense, sure. You got to do some web work to add it to your web page, sure, that's acceptable. Basically, anything that would be a legitimate expense to that event's bottom line, other than money that would go to a person, that's legit.
So one of the things that I wanted to add to the expenses we pay for is that sometimes what we're paying for frees up that organization to pay their teachers, to pay their speakers. We just don't want our funds used to pay the speakers. But all these places, a lot of our grant recipients are paying writers to teach. Sometimes they volunteer, but a lot of times they are getting paid. But what we do is we help them out with their expenses so that there's money for them to do their job, which is to pick speakers or to pick people that can apply and go to that workshop.
I think that's an excellent workaround. You just pointed out that people might just need to think of it that way, that they're thinking of ways that they can have expenses freed up so that they might be able to get that speaker in that they really want.
So I'll give an anecdote that
Sure.
When we gave a grant for a travel expense, the applicant came back to us and said, oh, you're too late. We've already paid for this writer to travel to our award ceremony. And we said, well, but that's okay, because now you can use that money and apply it in your records to the travel expenses, and that'll free up money for you to do something else. So that's, kind of a bookkeeping thing, but that's what we want to see when they send us a record of how the money was spent. We want to see expenses. And if they send in sometimes in their budget for their application, they will tell us, oh, we're paying for this speaker, and then they'll list all the other expenses, and the committee will just ignore. If you put in something to pay writers or if you put in something to pay speakers, The committee will just ignore that, and they will look at the other expenses and see if they can award those. So you don't have to not list that you're paying people, but the committee will immediately ignore those.
Okay, that's a very forgiving grant application.
That's what we like to say, is that once you have the right project, it's not a difficult application.
Mm-hmm. So what sort of expenses maybe listed in applications have you seen that are definitely off limits that people shouldn't include?
Nathan, you want to list them, or shall I?
Contest prizes, startup fees, legal fees to take your organization from a for-profit to a not-for-profit, which can be a little bit expensive. We don't have all that kind of money to be able to spend it on all of those things. As an organization, SFWA has had some rough patches with contests, and so contests, we are not going to support a contest. We're not going to support a startup. If this is your first year, come back to us next year. Once you've got a track record showing what it is that you're doing, come back to us with your track record, and that's going to give you a much better foundation. We expect that we will give out every penny that we have in the pool for this year. We don't expect that everybody, in fact, I would be really surprised if anybody got everything that they asked for, because we want to give as many people as much support as we can, as many organizations as much support as we can, which means we can't give somebody a lot. And those kinds of startup expenses are typically, they're not a good bet.
So what sort of advice would you give to someone who's just starting up a project and they want to apply for a Givers Fund Grant?
Oh, an excellent question, because we have had grant applicants in that category. If you are on your own and you're just starting up, then we want to see a track record of what you're doing. But what a couple of entities have been, or groups, projects, have been able to do is they use another C3 public charity as their umbrella. There are groups out there that will help startups. For example, the Baltimore Science Fiction Society helped start a reading series in Baltimore. We don't give a grant to the reading series in that case. We give the grant to the Baltimore Science Fiction Society. And there have been similar cases like that. So if you were starting a project, it would be a good idea if you can use connections, and there are people that can help you with that, to find a umbrella organization that automatically is considered, which is a C3 type entity. And that way you could actually come in, because they may have as part of their mission to help startups.
So in that way, an individual can illustrate the project's track record by working with an organization that already has an established track record.
Exactly. If the other organization is a C3 in good standing, we can award the grant to them, and they will then have it as part of their mission to dispense it to the person that has a startup project.
Great. So how much money does the typical grant winner get from the Givers Fund?
The majority of them will be $1,000 to $2,000. Some people are asking for a lot less than that. Our largest grant funds a workshop at a university for writers that are already established, and that one is several $1,000s. That's our largest fund grant that typically comes in every year. But most of them run $1,000 to $2,000, because the committee wants to fund as many of the vetted applicants as they possibly can.
And what are some of the organizations that have been awarded Givers Fund grants in the past?
Well, okay, I'll start with the groups, which is that we've funded a lot of workshops. We've funded archives for science fictional records, for the archiving materials. We fund conventions that often have workshops or science tracks, reading groups, and unusual publications, as long as we're paying like the expenses to run the website annual hosting fees, that kind of thing. We have an applicant this year asking for help with a podcast. So there are things like that that we would be doing. But for the groups and the workshops, it's well-established workshops. Alpha is a workshop for high school students. Clarion West, Odyssey have all had grants. There have been a lot of them at conventions. Turkey City Workshop sponsors people to go to one of the big conventions in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and we've sponsored their ability to sponsor people to the writing workshop there. We have, there's a Chicago reading series, a Baltimore reading series. We've done Denver reading series, University City Library, Iowa City. We've done some interesting outreach stuff, which is we've worked a little bit, given a little bit of money to the African Speculative Fiction Society, to a new startup magazine that was printing African writers, to Connor Bust, who was trying to help people get to conventions, to the Dream Foundry, which helps new writers, and that kind of thing. Our most unusual ones, I'm very proud of one that tends to get funded every year. A writer in Dallas puts together science fiction short stories, which you can submit, with visual art, with musicians, and it's shown at a local art gallery in Dallas once a year for about a week or 2 weeks. And she pays for it all out of pocket or with tiny grants from Texas or Dallas and a tiny grant from us. And that's how she pays for the space, and it's mostly the advertising that we help to fund. So it's a lot of fun things like that. Our favorite strange grant went to a science fiction musical that was written by a graduate student, and it won an award, and they needed rehearsal expenses help in order to get it together to be shown at a festival in Chicago.
If we don't have a recording of that, we need to go drum it up somewhere.
They have some on YouTube.
Awesome. So are there any tips or best practices you've noticed that make an application more likely to win one of our grants?
Nathan?
A clear plan. Having a clear plan makes a big difference. Having a list of expenses and how much you think you're going to spend on each of these things. Having a detailed list. Filling out all of the form. Putting in your email address so we can get back to you. Those are helpful things.
Yeah, the committee is not happy when they can't see how the money will be spent. If it's a loose budget, they get in there and they go, well, that doesn't sound like a airfare expense for that city. So be realistic with when you're asking for specific expenses. They also, there's a bang for the buck kind of attitude on the committee. The more people this project serves, the more the committee is likely to fund it and as high as possible. Things like reading programs and reading series, they probably have a soft spot for those, especially for young people.
Yeah. So what are some common mistakes you see in applications for the Givers Fund Grant?
Incomplete employer identification numbers.
Yeah, there's the other is the making sure that you're actually in good standing in your state if you're coming in as a C3. We've had several applications in the last couple of years where the applicant had been in good standing but had failed to renew or had not continued with their paperwork or
Right.
had dropped the ball in a couple of places. And when they applied to us and we went and checked, they weren't actually a C3 in good standing. So basically make sure that your business is in order before you make the grant application.
So the grants committee seems very forgiving of forgetting to leave information out, or perhaps giving you too much information, but you don't want to leave any of those fields blank.
Yes, it's what we look at, actually the two of us see everything first. And if we see it's incomplete, I have a tickler that before the deadline, I will go back to someone and I will say, hey, I need your full number. Your state of incorporation isn't correct. Little things like that. And it's like if I see something that is missing that would be part of the due diligence, I don't want them to fail just because they got their, it's Indiana versus Ohio, and they can't remember which state they were incorporated in, or, Chicago, Illinois and Indiana are very close. So little mistakes like that happen. And sometimes I'll peek over in the other Secretary of State and say, hey, there's a company over here that has your name. So that's probably you.
That's very forgiving.
We want people to apply for this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So
more to the point, we want people to win the award.
Yes.
We want people to get the grant. And so whatever we can do to help them get the grant, that just helps SFWA.
So say I have filled out the grant, I remembered all of my information, I have a great plan, and I have submitted it. What happens now?
Well, first thing I do is I look at it to see if there's anything missing. And if there's anything incomplete, we get back to them. And then Nathan and I sit down and we look to make sure all their ducks are in a row, because we would get in trouble giving them a grant if they claimed they were a C3 and they weren't, and they might get in trouble but we would get in trouble for the most part. So we go in and we check and we make sure that they are a C3 if they say they are. We look up their history. Any sort of company, we look up their history. We make sure that everything that they say they are, if they say, here's our website and here's what we've been doing, we go out and we check that, yes, that information is there. In other words, we make sure that their package, their submission package, is complete, accurate, and has everything the committee needs, because they just want to sit down and entertain themselves by reading about these different projects. They don't want to worry about whether it's an allowed or not. Everything that goes to them could be a grant award.
So what you're saying is the committee enjoys reviewing the applications and looking at potential projects to fund.
That's been my experience. It's been the same group for several years. And my experience is they enjoy the time that they have to look at these. I've seen them get very excited over certain projects. Nathan and I get very excited over certain projects. And we kind of, sometimes when we hand them something, we're not quite sure how they're going to react to it. But we, like the science fiction musical, we were like, okay, it's about science fiction. It's expenses. It's interesting. It will raise awareness, but we have no idea when we pass it on if they're going to agree with us or not.
Yeah, that was the one that just it just stays with you because it was such an unusual one, and they had checked all the boxes. They were legitimately who they said they were. They were absolutely outreach. They were doing all of the things that we would award a grant for. If I remember correctly, what they wanted was funding for building sets and costuming.
Costuming, rehearsal space, set money, and it wasn't a lot.
And it was like $300 or something. It was a very small number. And so it's like, okay, well, let's see what we throw it over the fence. Let's see what the committee says. And they funded it.
And one of the things about them was they were already in this festival. What they were, it was a graduate student who wrote the musical. The musical had already been through acceptance as a graduate student project, and it had then been invited to be performed for several performances in Chicago when it had been written in California. So they were desperate to find some funds in order to rehearse and make their costumes and get their act together. And so we threw it to the committee and they agreed to it. Another one that we thought was very unusual was a summer camp for people learning to make films. And it's a high school student, under 18. And it was filmmakers who wanted to develop young filmmakers. Well, a lot of the interest of the students was in the science fiction and fantasy area. So they clipped several YouTube clips of student projects as part of their application. And everybody had a great deal of fun watching those.
Great. So after Oz and Nathan have vetted the applications, you send them to the committee, and then what happens?
The committee makes their decisions, and they send it back to us, a list of what they propose. And then it goes to the board, where Nathan takes it to the board. Go ahead, Nathan.
Yeah, I take it to the board because as CFO, I'm on the board. So I take the recommendations from the committee back to the board and tell the board who we're going to fund and for how much. And the board then votes up or down. And we occasionally have a problem with a board member who is going to participate in one of these events, and so they have to recuse themselves from voting, they have to abstain.
And the board often wants to know why a particular grant. A couple of times the committee will turn something down and they want to know why.
I want to know why.
Because they have the right to overrule the committee's decision in that case.
But then once the board approves whatever they approve, as much of it as they approve, then we send out the happy newsletters and the not so happy newsletters.
Hopefully not many unhappy letters.
But then we notify them, and we usually by that point we know how we're going to pay them, because that's one of the things they're supposed to fill out. And once it's been approved, I notify them, and then Oz pays them.
After we get an acknowledgement back from them that they are willing to accept the grant and that they will report back to us with how the expenses were spent, how the money was spent.
Right.
Okay. So when will the Givers Fund grants be awarded this year? And all years, I should say.
I hope by Christmas. The deadline is in about 6 days, 5 days, 6 days. Oz and I will take a week or so to go through and vet them all. Then we'll give them to the committee to go through and decide. And some years it's pretty fast. Some years there's a lot of back and forth. Some years life happens. But I hope we'll get them out in December so that they'll know for 2021 what their grant funding from SFWA will be.
Yeah, so it kind of, everything has to fall into place. But in the years where there's a lot more grant application than there is fund available, that ends up being tougher for the committee because they want to give everybody something. And so they kind of have to discuss back and forth, and they have to hit the target cap. And then it goes to the board, and sometimes the board wants to discuss it. But by Christmas, which we would try, we actually have a goal of a little bit before that, because if we can get everything done by the 15th, then we can probably cut the checks and do the PayPals by the end of the year. Otherwise, in a year where life happens or something happens, it's generally January to early February before the actual money is dispersed.
So if someone is applying for a Givers Fund grant by that October 1st deadline, they are applying for funds that will be used the following year. Is that correct?
Not
Yes.
necessarily.
I heard a yes and a not necessarily.
Not necessarily, because someone missed the deadline last year when it changed. And the person said to me, does it have to be for an upcoming project, or could it be to reimburse us for something that has already happened? And there is nothing in the grant that says that it can't be for something that has already happened recently. So you could apply for funds. And she even said, then, can I then apply for the next year? And I said, yeah, we don't have anything in the rules that says that you can't do that. What the committee will decide is another question, but it's a project we've funded before. And so it's just going to be interesting to see what happens when that actually goes to the committee, whether they go, oh, we're not doing 2 years, but it's a very small grant. So that was another reason why I thought, yes, it was possible. But when they asked that, I was like, well, we don't have a rule that it can't be for something that's already happened.
I get the impression that you take great joy in finding ways to not get around the rules, but play as widely as you can within those rules. And I think that's awesome.
It's important for SFWA to do this outreach. This is probably one of the largest opportunities for SFWA to influence the wider field that we do. It's one of the most important things we do. And so, yeah, it's not a lot of money, but it's a seed. It's a place to start. It's something that's important for SFWA to do as an organization. And so, yeah, we're going to do everything we can to make sure that we can give out every penny that we have in the pool this year and have it go to as many different people to do as much good as possible.
I think what I like about the Givers Fund is that this is the benevolent fund that isn't about personal tragedy. When you go to the emergency medical fund, something awful has happened in your life that prevents you from writing. When you go to the legal fund, or when we do something out of the legal fund, writers are being attacked. So this is, when people come to us for COVID help, the difference in the Givers Fund is that it's a happy thing. These are good projects. These are positive things. And we really want to emphasize that even though we go, no, 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 you can't personally benefit, we want to give this money away, and we've given it away. I love the fact that we've given it away to high school students over and over again who are going to be future readers and writers, that it also goes to brand new writers, that it went to these crazy side areas. It's gone to a blog for reviewing games in their expenses, not to do the reviews, but to buy the games. They funded buying the games for the reviews. So it's a happy thing. And giving it away is the whole goal of it. That's why they had to put a cap on how much we could give each year. Because you don't want it to all go in one year.
So let's say someone applied, they made the deadline, and their project was rejected. Should they reapply next year?
They should email givers.grants@sfwa.org. If they didn't get an explanation in the letter, then they should email us if that's what they want to do. And we do discuss where they failed. If it's in the committee, we can only speak generically. The other option is often they know a board member, and they can talk to that board member as well as to what happened. It might be they were too new and the committee couldn't see what the benefit was yet. The committee wanted them to be going a couple of years. or it could be that it was a little too close to being someone's personal way of making money, something like that. But usually we will try. And we have told people, do X, Y, and Z and come back next year. Get your ducks in a row. Get your state registration. You failed because your state registration was, when I went to your Secretary of State, they said you were not in good standing. That's an easy one to fix.
They don't, it's not like when they don't get the award, it's not like the Dear Author letter. We actually, I send them to each individual one, and I tell them as much as I can about why the grant didn't go. So quite frequently, their email, the response they get from me, and it comes directly from me, the response they get from me explains why it didn't get funded. It may just be that the committee didn't find it suitable. It wasn't reaching enough of an audience. It wasn't, you know, there was something about it that we just didn't go. And usually there is a reason, and usually I share as much of that reason as I can within the bounds of keeping the actual deliberations of the committee confidential. But it's not like, Dear Author, we liked your work, we can't publish it. It's sorry that this didn't go. We've got a couple of people who keep applying, and we keep giving them the same advice that they keep not following. And every year it's the same. So if you're only going to send us the same application that got rejected, don't apply. But find out, write to givers.grants. That comes to Oz, it comes to me, it comes to a couple other people. And we can help negotiate that for the next go round.
Can you share a few more tips on what someone should not do when they're applying for the Givers Fund Grant?
Okay, so a couple of things that I've seen that can damage your application that is otherwise a fabulous application is that sometimes when someone's doing an application, they think it will be more appealing to SFWA if they mention that the teacher at the workshop is a member of SFWA or is a board member of SFWA. And that actually can damage your application because it might create conflict of interest. It is better to be generic, saying that you're going to select a science fiction fantasy author to come and teach the workshop rather than tell the grant committee specifically who it is. And the other thing that I sometimes see on applications, and this won't fail your application, but it's kind of the reverse. And that's when people try to appeal to SFWA by saying they're specifically going to be working with underprivileged or some underrepresented groups. The goal of the application is to talk about how you're going to raise up science fiction and fantasy. The secondary aspect of it is to say, oh, and by the way, it is also going to help these underrepresented groups. So it's a question of emphasis, because our mission is to raise up science fiction and fantasy and horror and related genres. So in that case, we want to see that be the first focus of the application project. And then the secondary is wonderful to tell us that it will also service an underrepresented or underprivileged group.
Can someone make an argument, do you think, that boosting the voices of underrepresented groups is furthering the field?
Not in and of itself. I think that you need to, in other words, okay, so Connor Bust likes to assist people that are underprivileged, and their C3 status does not specify a particular group. It's just anyone who is underrepresented or underprivileged. They asked for a grant to assist people to travel to science fiction and fantasy conventions. So that had the effect of broadening the science fiction and fantasy mission while also doing the second thing. So it's really, the committee needs to be able to look at it and go, okay, you're doing this first, science fiction and fantasy uplifting, and second, you're also doing something that is currently a big push at SFWA. But the Givers Grant itself, the Givers Fund, is primarily about uplifting the genre first and foremost. And then, yes, please, you might get more. I mean, that's something obviously that just makes the application that much stronger.
Okay. So can recipients of Givers Fund grants reapply?
Absolutely.
Oh yeah, all the time.
Absolutely. We love returning stories. Several of the classic workshops that have been around for decades send us, we love photos, pictures, testimonials, letters, students that have done little YouTube thank yous. And they come back year after year and the committee goes, oh yes, we remember them. And if it was a successful, that's the thing, is when you send in what you did with the money, the success that you show in doing that is very helpful in your next application.
That's great. So what are the responsibilities of a grant winner to the program after they've been awarded the funds?
They have to tell us how they spent the money. They have to give us a report after they've spent it, to tell us how they spent it, what they did with it, what the outcome was, what they, anything they want to tell us about. This is what we planned to do. This is what we had to do. This is what we wound up doing. This is how we think we made an effect on uplifting science fiction. This is what we think the good we did is. And they just have to send us a report at the end of the year, or when it's over.
Oh, what if you receive a Givers Fund grant and then something happens and the project you received it for falls through?
Well, the first thing you do is you email givers.grants@sfwa.org, or you send a note to Nathan, who sent you your acknowledgement letter, your award letter, and you explain the situation and you say what is going on. And we have had offers, sometimes if it's an absolute impossibility to continue, everything fell apart, they return the money, or they say, can we use it for this instead? Can we postpone it to next year? We can't do it this year because of lockdown. Can we postpone it to next year? Can we use it for a virtual event instead of an in-person event? And we really appreciate that people come back and they ask us that question. And it's not something that then has to go back to the committee if it's still within the structure of what it is that they were trying to do in the first place. Nathan usually says yes.
Yes, he does.
So one final question. Where should folks go if they have more questions about Givers Fund grants?
Givers.grants@sfwa.org.
Givers.grants@sfwa.org.
Thank you very much, Nathan, who is our Chief Financial Officer, and Oz, who is our comptroller, for answering these questions about the Givers Fund grant. Thank you for your time and all you do for SFWA.
You're so welcome, and thank you.